How might becoming the vessel create soul-aligned change? In this episode, I'm joined by one of my favourite past guests, Aidan Wachter. Aidan is an author, animist, and healer, and he has been involved with practical magic since the 1980s. He's an animist and is deeply concerned with the effects of the modern Western lifeway on the human animal, on both physical and spiritual levels. In this episode, we explore the concept of vessels in magic and witchcraft, and especially vessels for self-discovery and transformation. Aidan reveals lessons from a significant breakdown, which he now sees was catalysed by the very work of his book Changeling, which is about this notion of becoming a vessel. But don't let that put you off. We discuss the fluid nature of identity, examine the qualities that define a witch, and consider the role of power in personal growth and the impact of reclaiming our energy from misaligned places. But before we jump into all of that good stuff, if you're struggling with the challenges of walking your soul path in this crazy modern world and you'd benefit from support, guidance, and kinship, come join our Academy of the Soul Unio. You can find out more and join us by hopping on over to bemythical.com/unio or click the link in the description. And now let's dive into the show. Hello, Aidan, back for another dance around the magical lands. Here we are.
How are you, Lian?
I'm very well and very much looking forward to this conversation. How are you?
I'm awesome. Things are good. Last time we talked, I was just prepping to head out on my bike ride and ended up doing 1,200 miles in the high mountains of Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico for a couple months, and it was awesome.
Yes. Yeah, you've had quite an adventure since we spoke last.
Absolutely.
And also quite an adventure between our last episode and the one prior to that, which I think will be in part at least what we'll be talking about today. So there's so many different strands we could pull at to begin this episode, but I'd like to start with this word, this symbol that we were just talking about around this notion of a vessel. And starting with that, this idea of a vessel and how it can have qualities and how we can become that vessel as a means of creating change. So would you just start there with your sense as to why this word and what that evokes for you?
Yeah, so magically, a vessel it's a really interesting word, and I think words are really interesting around magic, especially in English, because we've got so many borrowings from different things. And so there's really interesting stuff around that idea. So the one is that it's a container, right? That it holds multiple things, or a lot of one thing, or a small amount of one thing. So a cup is a vessel. In the context of what we're talking about, a cauldron is a vessel. But it's also interesting because it's also a vessel is like a channel, right? Like blood vessels, if we think about that. And so it can be, or vessels as ships, right? There are all of these containment, travel, movement of things, whatever those things are that we're talking about. And so we can have like physical vessels in magic. So like I have charm bags around that are little pouches that are vessels that contain the various materia of a piece of work that I did. And then there are also kind of conceptual vessels, like are there ideas that hold a collection of ideas? So one way we could say that like Jungian psychology is a vessel holding a whole bunch of things that are related and interrelated items, and we subdivide them to that degree of naming them. This is Jungian psych versus Freudian psych because they're different containers, really. But the other piece of that is that we are vessels for power, for history. Lee Morgan, who I bring up all the time, has a beautiful thing in their last book that where he refers to us as the ancestors walking. And so I am that vessel for them. And then when we're talking about conceptual vessels, it's also like all of the ideas around something we could say are contained within that, the conceptual vessel of that idea. And so we could look at kind of modern Western capitalism is a particular vessel that holds a bunch of ideas, that there's a tendency for a lot of folks to look at that and say that's reality, versus that it's just a section of reality that's been fit into that container.
I love the way that you've spoken about vessels in, so many different sort of sizes, shapes, things we wouldn't even think of vessels. I think that's very helpful to illuminate that one way or another, we are, if I may turn it into a verb, we're kind of vesseling anyway.
I don't think you can get around it.
It's just whether it's a vessel you are actually choosing or not, which kind of brings us to where we're wanting to go in this episode. And I think whilst there is definitely a desire in me to sort of talk about this in a way that is something we're inviting the listeners into, as well as ourselves, I think there is something in the story of the book you wrote, how you came to write it, and then also how you've experienced that yourself. I think that would be a really nice place to start, and then kind of look at that in a way that, this is the opportunity for all of us.
No, so absolutely. So Leanne and I have been talking about my book Changeling, which is the last book that I published before I went underground and worked some stuff out, which is related. And first I would say that I'm very aware that in that idea of the vessel as a channel, like blood vessels, I am that for some things in the world. And so it's why I talk about books being kind of transmissions, even though I don't love the kind of new age channeling idea. There's something very real in there as well. Not that everybody that claims to be that is that, or they take it places I don't think make sense, but I'm very aware that I'm speaking for myself and the things that hang out with me in a lot of cases. And so each of my books I can look at that way. And so if we were to look at 6 ways, that's kind of the container of my practical magic background, right? That's like a vessel to pass that on to somebody. And Weaving Fate is kind of the container of the narrative magic and some related things. And so Changeling came about in a funny way because I just start writing, and eventually the allies show up, and they showed up really hard. And we're like, write about witchcraft. And I'm like, I don't want to write about witchcraft because I've always avoided that term, even though it's a very big part of my practice. And I have avoided it because it's so loaded. It's loaded kind of culturally. If we look at dictionary definitions, it's, a practitioner of malefic magic, usually female. Like that's about as loaded as you can get, right?
Yes.
And then you view how that got shifted into modern Wicca, which became the witch is this nature religion, less operative magic. Why I kind of avoided the term was because people were so invested. And I didn't want to be stepping on anybody's toes when I had a really different take on it.
Oh, I just want to share. I just realized because my background in shamanism and in, different ways is similarly so loaded, and understandably so. And as you were talking there, I was like, yes, I have something very similar kind of, there's actually very unfolding Barry directly right now as we speak. We seem to have lots of, I've noticed, like these synchronicities that show up in our lives at the same time, you and I. But yes, I now, because my path hasn't been so obviously around that word witch, I'm now realizing that, of course, like this, it's the same as or similar to my journey, but with the word shaman. So I completely get it.
Right. And so I eventually submitted to the allies, because that always works in the book world and the rest of it doesn't. We do what they say at the end. And
does it work? Does it work not listening to them in any part of your life?
It does not really. No, but yeah, it's no. But so as I started getting into the book, I was like, so I had to really look at, what do I think this is and why am I uncomfortable sharing my takes on it? And so again, this is not to suggest that I have an answer here or that this is correct. This is what I got to. And so witchcraft as I found it, which came through Starhawk and Raymond Buckland in the US in the late 70s, early 80s, and then Anderson Ferry tradition, is very clearly not a continuation of this ancient European folk religion. I believe that there are forms of witchcraft that are much closer to that, but definitely not what I was exposed to. But as I was kind of diving into all that stuff in the early days, I was going back at what was available then, which we did not have the research we had now. This is way before Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon and things like that, or even just modern scholarship on it anywhere. And so, which, as we think about it in kind of the modern magical pagan sense, comes to us from this kind of odd lineage of, yes, some folk practices, cunning man practices, things like that. But it comes to us through this book Aradia by Charles Godfrey Leland, which is this interesting anti-oppression document from Leland, basically, that he came to him from a woman in Italy named Maddalena. And then also from Margaret Murray's books, The Witch Cult in Western Europe and God of the Witches. And these informed Gerald Gardner, who brought us Wicca. And when I started looking at Changeling, what I got was, what if I don't care about any of the historical validity or the arguments for or against any of that? Just if I look at this operatively, what do I think we're dealing with now? And what I came to is that if we look at Leland's Aradia and we look at Murray's work, not as good or bad anthropology, but as narrative magic, as we've talked about around Weaving Fate, what if we view them as hypersigils? We go, well, then they're perhaps the most effective hypersigils that have ever been created that we know of in the modern realm. Because we could also say, like, the Abrahamic religious texts could be viewed that way too. And what they kind of put forward was this idea of kind of a counterpart to the really scholarly, often heavily church influenced because of who could read and who could write that we get out of ceremonial magic, Eliphaz Levi on through, Golden Dawn and all that stuff. That they kind of proposed this alternative view of what kind of this magical spirituality could be. That was very much about operative magic. And kind of directly, if you look at kind of what Christina Oakley Harrington has to say about her experience within Gardnerian witchcraft in the UK, very much ecstatic shamanic type traditions. So that is where I kind of got into the book and went, okay, if I view it that way, how do I want to approach this concept of the witch?
Love that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so what happened was I knew I had to have a practical section, but I decided that that would be at the end of the book. And instead I started it, and the majority of the book is 55 qualities, and it's called A Book of Qualities, Changeling, A Book of Qualities. And these were ideas around what I felt about what made a witch.
Mm-hmm.
Not as if you don't do these things, you aren't it. It has nothing to do with it. This is all personal. And so it was ideas around power, around energy work, around what you use and what you don't use, around how you control your thoughts, your words, your deeds, about understanding causality in particularly magical ways. All of these ideas. And I went, okay, so this then becomes a conceptual vessel, Changeling does, for my ideas around what does this word mean to me and why is it in some ways so problematic when tried to mesh my views with those who are super attached in a religious fashion to the term, which I'm not. And that's kind of how the whole thing came about.
So would you share, before I know you sort of like gesture towards them, but share some of the qualities and perhaps share the ones that have then created what you experienced next.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
The first one in there, which is, I have to really throw out to my friend Dre, who edits all my books, because she helped me organize all this stuff in order. But the first one that's in there is A Witch Seeks Power. And this is a really important concept because you're not supposed to.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to, unless you are, some kind of greedy billionaire class, then that's okay. But you're supposed to not go after that because power corrupts, absolutely, right? And so it had to start there. Like, okay, if you're going to get engaged with the world, and if you believe you have a right to influence how it goes, and you believe that that is correct, let alone if it's possible not to, then that has to be kind of step one. So you have to look at your engagement with power and the fact that, yes, you're seeking power. That's kind of step one.
Spicy.
Follow,
Came in hot.
comes in hot. And it moves into different aspects of what that means. So, like, energy is important in the sense that this is the stuff we can actually manipulate however we're doing it. And this is a super vague term, and I appreciate that it's a vague term. And I like it as a vague term because, again, we're talking around most spirituality related stuff, which this very much is, about things that are ineffable, right? They're not explainable by words, so we come up with proxies. But there is some form of energetic power in the world and life flow that animates us and animates everything that's alive that we know and that animates the spirit world. So you have to seek that. And then you actually have to claim your place there. Finding it is not enough. You actually have to go, okay, some of this is mine. And I get to choose what I do with it. Which is another interesting thing for some of us to go like, yeah, is that legit? Do I think that that's legit? And this became kind of the process of the book, because there's a lot of questions to ask yourself in the book. There's a couple hundred questions kind of thrown through here as part of the text. So you can kind of look at like, are you cool with this? Why aren't you cool with it? Where do you think that came from? If you're not cool with the idea that you have power or that you should claim your power or that you should be able to wield your power, where do you think that idea came from? Because it didn't come from you. None of these ideas come from us. They came from, your parents or your culture or your school. or your religion.
Yes, there can be this. Sorry to jump in there, but I think this is a really important part. In fact, I'm going to say this other thing that was just occurring to me first, which is a slight segue, but it feels like it's there to be named. We were talking earlier about mine too, but yours was the focus of the conversation around that kind of like resistance to the word teacher, and then I'd kind of thrown in like I'd thrown in this kind of like ball with a big like healer written over it, and you're like, whoa, I don't want the word healer, so I'll take the word teacher instead. But I was just thinking it's so funny because so much your books are really a teaching, but I was also appreciating in what you were describing there about those questions. You've got a very, I guess, natural Socratic teaching style where it's very much more about midwifing that gnosis, wisdom, understanding from the student, from the reader. And I was considering my style is very similar, and I wonder whether those of us that have that more of a, I'm not going to pretend I have the answers and I'm going to teach you them, but I'm going to teach you how to get at them. I think there can be this uneasy relationship with the notion of teacher because it doesn't feel like that's what's happening. And it just occurred to me as you were saying that. So it's not to go into, I just wanted to like offer you that.
No, it's actually really important. I think it's really important because there's a lot of, as anybody that's ever played, and whether it's magic specific, which is my world, or general spirituality, there are a lot of folks that the only way that they kind of know how to do this is through I have the way. And I'm not that person. I'm absolutely on the path. I have been for a long time, and I don't think you get off the path. And so for me to claim that I know other than what has worked for me, and we'll get into some of how that works a little bit later, that's all I got, you know? And it's also, if I look at like the progression of my relationship with witch, that I found, I think, the spiral dance in 79 when I was 12. And I immediately connected to it. And it was only later that I kind of had to put that witch thing away, because I started meeting witches and I was like, I don't think these people would really like where I'm at with this. And I was right. I wasn't wrong about that.
It wasn't just paranoia.
It wasn't just paranoia. And I was also like interested, and this is true about all of my magical stuff. It's why I change up what I describe myself as all the time. As I don't like the labels, because I don't want to calcify something that is by nature fluid and living and growing. And so I'd rather describe myself using 5 terms and say, but I'm not attached to any of those. Because to me, that's that's just way more accurate. It was, again, it's kind of why, like that, and I've talked about this some, I don't know if we have, but it's like really embracing non-binary. Like, that's a great thing, because this is utterly the vaguest thing you could come up with. It's very clear what it isn't, but it isn't clear what it is. And I think that that's a much better place to operate from. And so again, kind of in this book, I've been really pleased that people have not gone, oh, he's trying to say this is what a witch is. It's like, no, these are just things to play with. I don't have any connection to what you're going to do with it.
I love that. I think there was 2 things I was going to say, and I think I've lost the other one because we've ended up going there. Can you remember where you were before I dived in?
I think I was just talking about kind of coming into, actually I was going to go somewhere from what you were saying, talking about the healer thing. So it was funny when that came in, because neither of us know where that came from. We discovered it in our lead into talking. But once that word got thrown out there, then the teacher term opened up for me. And then what also opened up for me is went like, how do you not view what you're doing as at least helping to facilitate some healing? Because it's everywhere. It's everywhere in everything I write. But it's, again, these are things that I'm
glad you can
uncomfortable
see
with.
that.
Oh yeah, no, I get it. But I don't like the definitions, and I definitely don't like the pedestaling of people.
Mm,
I don't like it when I do it if I catch myself.
hmm
And I certainly am uncomfortable when it's kind of pointed in my direction. Because again, I think it closes that. It closes
Yeah.
things down, right? It's a constriction of something that's fluid. Um, but it goes straight back to that. So like if we start with the idea of that a witch seeks and claims power, that begins to open up this whole can of worms, because it's like, well, what is power? Is it a corrupting influence, or is it just the ability to do work, right? Which would be one
Mm,
definition of it, you know? Um, and then from that, in the book, it moves on through different things, and it goes into the concept of the vessel and you viewing witchcraft as a vessel, and then viewing the witch as a vessel. And that if you are a vessel, and this is independent of whether you want to use the witch word, and I would say this book is not reliant on it, even though it had to be in there very heavily for the way it was framed. You have to choose what that vessel holds and what that vessel lets go of, because that's what makes you who you really are in the moment.
mm,
Which I think is a huge function of all of this stuff. Is some of it is learning that that's a choice, or learning that some of it's a choice. Maybe not all of it is. You know, we all have shaping influences that are beyond our control. That's real. But if that's a choice, I don't know that there's a more important choice. Like, what are you going to anchor to? What are you going to say? Yeah, this is something I'm going to pull inside of me and hold. And then therefore, it's like you have to learn how to let go of the stuff that doesn't have a place. So throughout
mm,
my life, I've had to learn how to let go, specific to our last talk, all the expectations that I learned were important were I to be neurotypical.
mm.
And so those had to go. And so it's really very much a process work of how do we, again, yeah, the conception is all around the witch, and it contains a lot of charms and spells. The process is very much just about being a person.
Mm. So I realised we were only chatting for about 10 minutes before we hit record, and we talked about so much because there's like so many places I want to pull on. What occurs to me is, and we both simultaneously had experiences of this recently, where we choose this particular form of vessel, or it chooses us. Sometimes I'm not quite sure which way around it works. But either way, we embrace it and do sovereignly choose to work with that particular vessel. And then the interesting thing is, when we then do share that with others in a way that we could describe as teacher, you know, whether that be in your instance through a book, or right now for me in a particular course I'm teaching, it invites us again, if we are seeing ourselves as this kind of, rather than this done deal, if we are seeing ourselves as also in that work of understanding the vessel and understand the qualities of that vessel and looking there, it can call us into a deeper understanding and embracing and honesty of whether we really do have those qualities, whether we've got qualities that don't really belong in there but are still up in the mix. And that can be quite harsh. That can be quite a harsh experience. And as I said, I'm experiencing my own version of that right now. But I know for you, that was at least part of what had unfolded, I think, during the writing of the book and then also afterwards. So would you share some of that? Because I think this is a very profound, it's slightly a cautionary tale, but also it feels to me it's kind of like, isn't that how magic works? It's kind of like it works, but
It
not
is.
always in the way that we might think it does.
So now with 3 books in, I kind of know this now in a way that I didn't before. 6 Ways taught me something, and Weaving
Hmm.
Fate taught me a lot more. And this book, uh, how I view it now and what we were talking about before is I really felt like the allies were like, look at all the things that are important to you in a life that is a magical life. And let's talk about them and let's ask
Hmm.
questions about them and kind of create something that could be used like a workbook for somebody to kind of help pick their way through some of this stuff. And I did that. And sometime after it was published, not that long after it was published, I began having what I refer to as a breakdown, which was a massive thing. Like I got wrecked. And coming out the other side of it, I was like, oh, okay. I also got shown all of the holes that I still have where I'm not actually like, I know better, but do I do better?
Mm.
Enough better? And this is not to be harsh about it. It's just reality. It's like, I have known for decades that our thoughts, our words, and our deeds are causative. Am I living that way always? Uh, am I holding the things I need to hold, and am I letting go the things I need to let go of? And the answer was no on a bunch of stuff.
Mm.
And it just took my world apart, which and this is the magic doing what magic does thing, I'm insanely grateful for. And it was probably the worst year and a half of my life to
Mm.
get there. So that's kind of the cautionary tale, is that if you're doing kind of any kind of self transformative work, whether you call that magic or not, um, if you're engaged with whatever you view as your allies or your guides towards something that is like personal evolution, it's gonna happen. Um, and probably the biggest error that I think drives the most people away from that work is that it doesn't happen in ways that you get total control over.
Mm.
Um, and you may not really know till you're well out the other side that this is to your benefit.
Yeah. Yes. You used the word holes earlier. When you were talking about you were kind of made aware of all the places you had holes. And I thought that was an interesting choice of words. Symbolically, if we have this notion of a vessel, of course, it could have holes. Did you use that word intentionally? And
Yes.
yeah, I'd love to hear you say a bit more about that because it really struck me as a symbol.
Um, if we go back into this, is an interesting thing. It's in Six Ways, my first book. I talk about this a bit in relationship to the vessel as well. Um, probably the easiest way for folks to kind of get the idea of the vessel is realize that your entire life is a vessel. Um, but things like your energy body are a vessel, and your kind of sense of integration, like integrity in that sense, not in a more moralistic view, but is a vessel. And we have gaps. I'd imagine everyone does, but perhaps you get through that. I'm not through that. Where you functionally have holes that operate like energy leaks. Um, and so you could view it, yes, as that if the vessel is a ship and it's got a hole in it, it's taking on water, and you have to put all this energy into bailing it out so that you can continue staying afloat. And this is what most of our life is in many ways. When
Mm.
we talk about putting out fires in our lives over and over again, we could view this as the same process, just with a different metaphor. But the other thing is, like, if you think of yourself kind of as a container that's more like a flexible container, like a balloon or an inner tube. Um, the amount of power you can hold is controlled by how much you're leaking out.
Mm-hmm.
And coming from through a lot of these processes, these are high energy, meaning that they take a lot of work processes. Another thing people don't necessarily get in the modern world is that this is not generally, again, there's a lot of stuff you can do that will make your life way better that doesn't work this way. But at the point you're kind of coming into operative magic in the way that I think about it, or if you're coming into kind of shamanic transformation work, if you're coming into serious integration work, it's a lot of energy. And so if you can begin to patch those holes and go, okay, I have this hole over here where I know I should always stand my ground about things that are kind of impinging into my ability to function well in a relationship. But I have learned not to. This was a big one for me. I've learned to play along to get along. And this is basically destroying my ability to actually be fully in my power. And what can happen is we end up then lashing out, doing whatever. That wasn't specifically what happened in my case, but it's one that I see the most commonly. Because we're trying to get people off as if that's the issue. Rather than going, I have gaps that I'm letting some shit in that I don't want in, and I'm letting some stuff out that I need to keep in. Right? So holes are very valid, I think. And also they can be like, we talk about holes of knowledge or understanding, which are like gaps, right? Like, what do I not get? And often I think when they get kind of, when they show up more violently, at least in my life, like they did with post-Changeling, it was really like the allies like, dude, you wrote it down. You know. And it was really like, I talked to you, I think, before about like that I have a pond that I work with here. There was a point where I was out at the pond, and that's when they came in and were like, dude, you wrote it all down. And I was like, oh, fuck. Okay, so there's no excuse. I do know. And now I have to figure out the next level. Because it's not that it was all absent. It's not, it's rarely that. It's just like, there are still gaps.
Yes, you probably wouldn't have been writing it if that were the case.
Hell no. I wouldn't have had any idea what I was writing. That's, but it did show all those gaps. In the way that it did it was like, either you believe this is true or you're right, you're going insane. Which is it? And I was like, oh, I know what's true here.
Yeah.
And that whole sense of like, I'm losing my shit is like, no, I'm not losing my shit. I'm kind of letting my shit go. Because there's still stuff that is not integrated here that I have to integrate. And so that became the work of a couple of years.
Yeah. What's just occurred to me that I wonder if you see it this way and also see that this is potentially what was occurring. Going back to this notion of power, which again is funny how controversial that term is used in the ways that we're talking about. But if we go back to this idea of power, when we've been on our path for some time, we might say that that has been a path of gaining power. We might not use that term in that way, but that really is what's happening, I guess, if we are actually on our path and making progress on our path. And using the language that we're talking about here, the more power that we are kind of are containing, wielding, the more even the smallest holes can have a big impact. And it's almost like, again, maybe stretching the metaphor too far. It's like the kind of level of pressure at which things kind of like gush out of even the small pieces. And I wonder if that was in part, it's like you say, you it wasn't that you were, hadn't done any work on these qualities. I think to a large extent you were embodying, so many of them. And yet it was because of the level of power, as well as the other qualities. I'm just using that as a kind of example here.
Yeah.
That what was left in terms of holes had the level of impact it had.
I think that that's very true, and it's, you know, it's and it is however you want to view that. And again, we can kind of view all of these terms as vessels, so that
Mm.
power is a vessel idea, right, for a bunch of things. But it's like
By the way, I love the way you're just like, yep, another vessel. There's a
it
vessel.
is.
I love
It's a
that.
really important idea for
Mm.
me because when I recognize that, I
Mm.
recognize where I've put power in external things a lot of the time,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Um, but it is one of the things that I think is interesting about kind of, call it spiritual work, for to keep it very general, is that it is like the further along you go, because we have this kind of view of the really chilled out person who's like got it all together, which is kind of a bad sign to me. That's not usually the person that I want to hang out with.
Mm.
Because what happens is that, again, if we accept that our thoughts, words, and deeds are causative, uh, every bit of that gets stronger when you do. And every bit of it wants clarity the more clear you get. Uh, and so, yeah, it's like it will, things that would have been irritants 20 years ago, I think now are just like devastating. It's like, because
Yeah.
they're like, no, deal with it now. You're getting old, boy. Deal with it now. You know,
Mm.
uh, and and so I'm happy to. That doesn't mean I'm happy at all when I'm in it, but it's like on the other side, you go, oh, thank the gods. You know, that's fantastic.
Mm.
You guys have my back so much. You're willing to like lay me out on it when that's the correct move.
Yeah. Oh, that brought tears to my eyes. That's I think there's a point at which even the toughest of initiations and gauntlets, you have this sense of, my back is had. This has deep meaning, and yeah, it's a cliche, but it will be okay. And it can be hard to recognize that when we're kind of really in the thick of it. But I think after a few of those gauntlets, we start to have that as a kind of touchstone as we
Yeah,
journey.
you know, when I was at the worst point in the kind of hole that I call the breakdown that I was in, um, was that point that I'm sure you know, where I went out to one of the kind of places in the land that I have connection to, which is a pond. It was just like, do it. I know something has to go, and I can't
Mm,
figure it out. So do it. And at the moment I handed that over and said, this is beyond me, but I know it could be something that I can learn. Like, show me, help me, teach me, guide me through this. Everything began to open up. It was still not pretty, and it took another year. Um, but it was at that point of knowing enough and having been through enough similar events and similar times in life that I could go, okay, just show me, help me out. I
mm,
admit we've moved beyond my capability right now, so help me get there. Um, is such a critical thing, uh, and I do have faith. I do know that they have my backs, and I do have that really strong sense that I mentioned. I think I don't know whether it was before we started recording or after, of what Lee says, that it's like I'm now very aware that I am my ancestors walking, and
mm.
even though some of them were evil shits, that whole stream goes back, you know, a million years to things well before people, as we think of humans. Um, and I am the manifestation of that, and all of that is behind me, and that's an incredible source of power and an incredible source of
Yeah.
comfort. Um, and it's also a kind of like a signpost, because you go, none of those lives were easy, and yet here I am 100 or 200,000 years since Homo sapiens formed out of what we were before that, who formed out of what we were before that. And so I know that I have the potential to do this next thing.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. It really struck me as you were describing being at the pond and asking for help, how that's something that I think we've largely lost touch with in our modern world. Unless we are in a religion where we might kind of see it as a type of prayer, I think that way you even described it's like handing it over. It's not always the aligned thing to do, but when it is aligned, it's the thing to do. But I think we've kind of got so used to either thinking we need to do, just I need to fix this on my own, need to figure this out, or go to other people. I think what you did there, it was striking me like, that's one of the qualities. I don't know how you would have named that in the book, but that occurs to me as one of the very qualities that would be aligned with a witch. But I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know that it's in the book specifically there, but it's kind of funny that shortly before I went offline during all of that, I did get a transmission from them and did a sigil for what they did that I call the carry sigil. And the carry sigil was really just a symbol that they gave me, that the idea behind it was that it was one that you would draw it on a piece of paper or whatever, and use it as kind of a gate to offering to whatever you view your peeps are, your gods are, your ancestors are, and say, I can't carry this. Will you help me? And I really feel like a lot of that experience that I had was really the integration of that particular concept. Was I really had to get to the place where I have as much of that got to do it yourself shit as anybody, and to a really horribly dysfunctional degree, in many ways. And probably the biggest thing that I've had to learn is to go, no, this is beyond me and I need help. And for me, that's mostly the allies, but it's also, finding the right therapist, whatever. And I think that that's a critical point, and it also sinks in. We've talked about my view of animism and all of this, is there's a point where you got to go, if you're really part of this kind of conscious living system, and you have allies that are available and you have ancestors that are present, you got to kind of be a little out of your mind to not be handing off, probably more than I do, to them and say, help. There's way more available power, presence, knowledge, all of that stuff than anything that I can contain myself.
It feels to me, and there's a big lesson in this for me personally that I'm just seeing as I'm speaking, but as this is about you right now, I'm going to direct it back to you. It feels to me that it took you writing the book and living the book to actually really understand that quality and embody it. Like, it couldn't happen the other way around.
No, I think that that's very true. And I think that for me, it's one of the weirder aspects of what I do, and I'm getting more comfortable with it now after this experience, that and I talked about it in my Patreon quite a bit, that I've become really fascinated by this sense that I have of an awareness that I have a function within the field or within the system, which is different than having a sense of purpose. Like, there's something that I actually do, and that's the functional aspect there. And some of that has to do that it only comes out, which is part of the humor about that, if I'm teaching. or if I'm transmitting, or if I'm talking to you, or if I'm, it's not generally as present for me. And that's just part of how I'm wired, or that's part of that function. I don't know. And so I've had to become very comfortable with kind of operating from where I am and knowing that even as I'm teaching, I'm being taught. And that's crucial. It's everything to me.
Hmm. Oh wow, there's something so powerful in that. As I'm teaching, I'm being taught. It's like true teaching perhaps doesn't work another way. There's something of the wounded healer in it, which is an archetype I have journeyed with a lot and love that it contains that humility and kind of ongoing change and healing. And what you just said, it feels like it's the same archetype, but when it comes to a teacher, there's something so so profound in that.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting one. I know I did a video on that in Patreon too, because somebody had asked, "Do you feel like it's beneficial to kind of your magical work to share it?" And I was like, not in the sense of this is the working that I'm doing, but it's critical for me that I share what I do. And the allies have been very clear on that since the first book. And
Mm.
really, even when I was making jewelry, they were like, no, we're doing this to move in the world in a way that you can help us move in the world. And I take that kind of more and more seriously. And I'm more appreciative of it too, because there is a way that I'm as self-centered as anybody. And it's difficult to learn to not have it be about you
Mm.
uh, in a lot of ways. Right now in the world is a difficult moment for that for a lot of folks. And so, yeah, I find like, how do I share what I have to share, but also not have it be all about me?
Mm.
And that's part of that kind of gift there to me as well. It's like, oh yeah, no, this is, if there was nobody on the other side, I wouldn't be thinking a lot of these things.
Yeah.
Because it's all co-work. It's me and the ancestors and the allies trying to move things into a better place.
Yeah. I feel like the tendrils of another episode are starting to starting to reveal themselves. We'll have a chat about that in a moment. But I was just getting this sense of like, oh, there's a whole conversation to be had here, just as we're about to need to close on this episode, which has been so wonderful and has absolutely flown by to the point where I can't actually believe it is time to close. So before we do, is there anything that you feel is really important that, or just is kind of on your heart, or your peeps are saying, like, make sure you say this, that you feel we need to talk about before we close on this episode?
Um, part of it is the time of year, and as well, the thing that the peeps are with me on a lot right now is really coming to terms to that idea that we are, how would I put it in a short form? Like, you aren't the actions of your ancestors, but you're the only one that can do anything about it in this world.
Mm.
Uh, and I'll be teaching Friday for a group the physical fever stone process for moving fate. Hey, says yes, do it. And so I would say, yeah, it's like, it's a good moment to kind of see, in whatever way makes sense to you. It doesn't have to be that for those that don't have the book, but realizing that there is kind of healing that's way more than even what we normally think about as multi-generational, that needs to happen in this place if we want to move forward at all. And that's, I think, what's kind of on my plate to be dealt with more as we go forward. So find something that works for that. even if that is just, making offerings of water to your ancestors and saying, hey, I see that you went fucking through it, and maybe you didn't come out clean, but I respect that. And see if we can do a little bit of cleanup for that, because I think that carries forward. And it also produces a lot of, for me at least, it lessens the weight when I go, okay, yeah, it's not that I have to forgive these people their wrongs, or that I have to try and correct them all in the physical world, because that's impossible. But I can acknowledge them and give respect for the fact that they brought us here.
Yeah. There's another synchronicity. I mean, as you say, it's partly the time of year, but we're each month in our Soul Academy, we do a different quest, and the one coming up is around the ancestors. It was a bones quest, and it feels as though there is something that's not just this time of year. It feels like there's something of this time where the
That's what I feel.
ancestors are, really calling for us to pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Aidan, regrettably, we need to finish this episode. Where can listeners find out about you and your wonderful work and your books, which I highly recommend?
Books are available on all the online resellers, bookshop.org, things like that, Amazon. I have a website that is in massive need of an overhaul that is very, very slowly happening at aidanwachter.com, and I am on Patreon and Instagram as Aidan Wachter, and most of the kind of teaching related stuff that I do happens on Patreon.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure, as always. We certainly did go dancing into the magical lands.
Absolutely. Thank you, as always.